Yeah. We're going on YouTube.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, including to those who are currently stood in the corridor. Which are between the four of us, we can all project that you can hear, and should there be a fire alarm of any kinds, we'll figure it out. I don't think there's anything we can do about it now, but thank you all so much for coming along today to this fringe event, focused on potential border arrangements for Scotland after independence. We've got a fantastic panel with us, so I'll introduce them first. To my left, we're very delighted to have the Cabinet Secretary for Constitution, External Affairs and Culture, Angus Robertson. We've got Professor Nicola McEwen, who is the co-director of the Centre for Constitutional Change, and Professor Anand Menon, who is the Director of UK in Changing Europe. And I'm Philip White, I'm Director of IPPR Scotland. We're Scotland's progressive think tank across a full range of public policy issues in Scotland. We work on a cross-party basis, we're neutral on the question of independence, but we're not neutral on the future of Scotland, importantly, which is what brings us all here today. And I think a very timely discussion that we'll have this afternoon, not least with, as we now understand, the publication of the next Independence Perspectives paper on the economy coming next week, which really sits at the heart of lots of the issues that we'll discuss this afternoon. Clearly, as attention turns towards a future independence referendum and against the backdrop of the experience of Brexit that's played out over the last few years, a key aspect of any independence debate will inevitably turn towards the potential border arrangements in independent Scotland. Not only does Brexit shape and influence independent Scotland's relationship with the EU as it inevitably sought membership, but it would also have a profound impact on any independent Scotland's relationship with the remainder UK. Not least one that potentially found itself on opposite ends of EU membership. So while the ramifications of the UK's border arrangements with the EU post-Brexit need to play out on a daily basis, this event will consider what Scotland can learn from that experience, the experience of the last couple of years in post-Brexit arrangements, and the type of relationship that it aspire to across all areas of policy. I think the coming weeks will be dominated by economic policy discussions, trade, external relations, everything else. But equally, really important issues around migration, social protection, education, and movement of people and goods across borders with the UK and the EU. So we'll hear from all the speakers this afternoon. I'll facilitate some discussion, and then really importantly, open to all of you, and delighted to hear your thoughts and comments on this issue. So without further ado, I'd be delighted to introduce Angus to say a few words first.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to come along, and thank you, all of you. I'm seeing a lot of familiar faces who are SNP delegates. I'm seeing a lot of familiar faces from the Fourth Estate, and it's nice to see you all. And it's also nice to see a good turnout from members of the diplomatic community, both based in Scotland and elsewhere in the UK. And I think that last fact tells you something about the importance of where Scotland is going. And this as an issue, as a manifestation of Scotland's transition from being a constituent nation of the United Kingdom, where we have no sovereign decision-making powers directly over our border arrangements, and with the attendant issues that go with that, from immigration through to dealing with refugee situations such as we have been doing with Ukraine. Before that was Syria, and with others. And normal countries make decisions about their borders. And just like many of the other issues, unfortunately, that are important to Scotland, issues around our borders are made by a party in government that we haven't elected since 1955. So that is an important early part of the context of the discussions that we're going to have. Next observation is that our plan, as you know, is that Scotland should return to become a member state of the European Union. Now, as my academic colleagues on the table will no doubt be talking about when I've finished, the context of Scotland becoming independent following a referendum in the autumn of next year is going to be different to Scotland becoming independent as a result of a referendum in 2014. Why? Because Scotland was, as the rest of the UK was, part of the European Union. And the context for us now is obviously very different. The UK is no longer within the European Union, so Scotland voting to become independent and joining the European Union then has a context in relation to borders. Minor footnote, about which I've seen next to no coverage anywhere in the Scottish media or elsewhere, is that border arrangements are currently being established in Scotland right now. Because as a result of the Brexit vote and the negotiations between the United Kingdom and the European Union, and the Northern Ireland Protocol and its workings, Northern Ireland, to all intents and purposes, remains within the single market of the European Union. And for that reason, the border, as such, when it comes to trade between the island of Ireland and Great Britain, falls in Scotland, as it does in a number of other places. So there is a requirement, because the consequences of the Northern Ireland Protocol and the arrangements that have been made in relation to that, that there should be border checks, for example, at Stranraer for trade going from Great Britain to Ireland and back. So there are many questions that we will be coming on to, but just as a scene setter, this discussion that we're having is not just an academic discussion about what may follow, and there will be different views on that, but this is something that is happening right now in terms of our border arrangements, and whether we think that they are the appropriate border arrangements or not. So that's introductory observation 1. Introductory observation 2 is this is an important consideration as part of the prospectus that the Scottish Government has been preparing to be published. As I mentioned this morning when I spoke to conference, we have published 2 papers as part of the prospectus series. As the First Minister has confirmed, the next paper that we will be publishing relates to the economy, and there are border ramifications as part of that. But there are further papers where there are other border considerations that come into play again. Now, probably to the disappointment, especially to the journalists in the room, they will understand that I can't give a sneak preview of boo. I'm getting. I will not out Kieran Andrews for mouthing boo from the back in a friendly way. I totally understand why there's an interest in this subject, and as we've been publishing the prospectus papers, quite rightly, there has been a big interest of what's in the papers and being able to interrogate what's in those papers, and that will happen at the appropriate stage in terms of borders. So, to an extent, I am hamstrung at this meeting in acknowledging the context of the discussion. It is an important thing. I agree with that. Can I take the opportunity to praise the work that has gone into both the paper? I don't know how many. Sorry, should I? I'm good for. I'm a great believer in props, as you all have known from this morning's presentation. But if you haven't yet seen it, please have a look at this. It's very interesting. It's very relevant, and you will hear in a moment why. Many of the questions that are raised in this have been informing our thinking. That will be reflected in the prospectus paper when it is published. And then no doubt we will come back and we will be able to compare notes exactly about what has been taken directly and where further work has been done. I should say, incidentally, it's a really good example of and hopefully best practice in government listening to academia, listening to those who do work in this area to inform our thinking on things. Government should never work in isolation, not listen to those who are thinking thoughts. Whether we agree with everything or not is incidental. On things like this, it's really important for us to hear what is being worked on, because there are a lot of dimensions to these questions, and we want to get them right. So there's not much more I want to say at this stage before we get on to the sort of back and forth, the questions that we've got. I don't think it's a surprise that we think that the common travel area is extremely important. For those of you who are unaware, there is free movement of people between the United Kingdom, the Irish Republic, and the Channel Islands and the Isle of Man. It is our expectation, our hope, our target that will continue to work as efficiently, as effectively as it has. very important to us. But beyond that, obviously, it will be important as we rejoin the European Union that we accept the workings of the European single market, that we find the most effective ways for us to reintegrate ourselves in the single market, and at the same time, it really matters that we have the best possible trading arrangement with the rest of the United Kingdom. And for us, it is going to be a key priority for us to be able to achieve both of those things. I'm going to stop at that point. I'm going to let the others say what they have to say, and no doubt we'll be able to tease some more of this out in the questioning from all of you who come along to this meeting. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Angus. Nicola.
Thanks, Heinrich. I was going to start by publicising this, but Angus has already done that bit for me, so thank you very much. First thing I should say is that academics, nobody has the answers for this, because this is about an uncertain future. But what we tried to do in this report is take what we know about borders, what we have learned as a result of the Brexit process, and not least with all of the issues surrounding Ireland, North and South, and think it through and apply it to the context of an independent Scotland. But there's still inevitably lots of uncertainty. The other thing to note is that we, reflecting on something that Angus said at the beginning, we also thought about Scotland's borders plural, okay? Because Scotland's borders with the European Union, in the context of independence and accession to the European Union, would open up, okay? They would open up in ways that they are not currently open because of Brexit. They would enable free movement of goods, services, people and capital within the context of the single market in a way that is not the case at the moment. And second, the border with Northern Ireland would be more open and in the context of independence than it is currently because of Northern Ireland's special status within the single market for goods. But when we talk about the border, and when the debate is about the border, it's often the land border between Scotland and England, and by extension, the political border and the trade border that would be between Scotland and England and Wales. And that's the biggest challenge, in a sense, from an independence perspective, because it would become, under EU membership, an EU external border. And that creates challenges, that creates responsibilities and obligations on the part of a Scottish government, if Scotland is to become independent in the EU border, are eligible to enter, are eligible to trade within the EU single market. So there is no getting away from the fact that there would have to be border checks. And what does that mean in practice? It means at the border checks. Now that's not that hard compared to how it would have been were there to be a hard border on the island of Ireland, because the geography, in a sense, makes the challenge in some ways less daunting. You're talking about 154 kilometres. We counted on a map, about 25 crossing routes roughly, mostly minor roads, one major trunk road, Glasgow to Carlisle, 3 others that are fairly major crossings. So in terms of a technological and physical challenge, it's not an insurmountable one. On the other hand, it's an awful lot of traffic to go through not very many crossing points. So there would inevitably be pressures on trade crossing that border. Second though, and perhaps most important, is that behind the border checks, a lot of the work in terms of border management no longer takes place at the physical border. It takes place in offices. It takes place in the specialist logistics firms that are set up and growing significantly in the UK to help the flow of trade across the new borders that we have. So it's the bureaucracy and the expertise that surrounds that, and getting the processes right to facilitate that kind of trade across borders would be really, really important, and could minimise the effect and the requirements that take place at the physical border itself. What I think, and Angus mentioned the importance of the common travel area, we are as confident as it's possible to be that you would not require passport checks at the border. The common travel area is already recognised within the EU treaties, and protecting the common travel area was one of the priorities of the Irish government in the context of Brexit negotiations. So the fact that this is in the interest of an existing member state is one of the things that gives confidence about the likelihood that of all the asks that a Scottish government might have of the EU in the context of accession negotiations, it's the one that I think is most likely to be conceded. And that would come with certain obligations, of course, as well, about protecting the external borders of the common travel area. But it would also come with some challenges, and there are some limits to that too. Perhaps we can come back to that in discussion. Final thing I would just say is that none of this is a fixed picture, because the nature of the challenge that would face an independent Scotland at the border, particularly at the land border with England and Wales, will be heavily influenced by the broader, bigger EU-UK relationship. If that relationship changes to something that is even looser than it is right now, then the challenge at the land border gets greater. If that relationship becomes a little bit closer, for example, I'm not suggesting that the UK will rejoin the European Union or even the single market anytime soon. I think that's been ruled out at the moment by including the Labour Party. But there might be other things, like a veterinary agreement, for example, that could eliminate the need for, we think, around 90% of the checks at the border. So what happens with the UK-EU relationship is really important to the context in which an independent Scotland would be trying to navigate these challenges in the future. Anna.
Thank you.
Thanks, Nicola. Hi, everyone. I just wanted to think a little bit about the lessons we can learn from Brexit for the debate about Scotland. I just want to list 4 lessons and a couple of observations to finish off. I mean, the first lesson is these debates end up being all about borders. Even if the actual referendum itself isn't about borders, dealing with the implications of a vote to leave will be all about borders. And I see here we've got our friends from Gibraltar who struggled with this border question in the wake of Brexit. So borders suddenly become contentious. And one of the good things, I think, about having this debate now is that when we had the Brexit referendum, we didn't talk about borders at all. That wasn't the issue, and I think, it is good to be honest and accept the fact that this is something that we need to be talking about. Second lesson from Brexit, I think, is the tone of the referendum itself matters enormously. No one in this room needs telling that referendums can be bitter, bad-tempered, and divisive. In terms of UK politics, the Brexit referendum helped to sort of not create, but to firm up new political identities. And there's still evidence in the polling that more people in the UK think of themselves as leavers or remainers than identify with any of the political parties, which is quite remarkable 6 years after the referendum. A bad-tempered referendum in which one or both sides think the other is arguing in bad faith does not make for easy negotiations post-referendum. So the way the referendum is carried out, the way it is handled, will have implications for what happens afterwards. The idea after the Brexit referendum, about 2 weeks after the Brexit referendum, I had lunch with the Swiss ambassador who said, "This is really weird." I said, "Why?" He said, "Well, in Switzerland, if we had a referendum, it was 52-48, both sides would sit in a room, say that was very close, So we should negotiate some kind of amicable compromise between the two sides, because clearly no one won by that much. And I sort of looked at him and I said, but the two sides couldn't sit in a room together after this referendum. I mean, this is part of the problem. So how the referendum goes will shape how the negotiations are carried out afterwards. The third thing, the real unknown, is what politics looks like post-referendum. We've seen with the Conservative government what happens if a referendum leads to the party in power depending on a degree of tension with its erstwhile partners to keep its coalition together. And I'm not saying that will happen in Scotland or it will happen in the rest of the UK. What I'm saying though is that politics will be reshaped by a vote for independence in Scotland. It will be reshaped north of the border, it will be reshaped south of the border. And the contours of that reshaping will determine how those negotiations go. Because actually, if you end up in a situation, which is a situation I believe we're in now with the government in Westminster, where the Conservatives need a degree of tension in our relationship with the European Union, because that's all that binds their base, that makes negotiating a way out of the situation or coming to an amicable agreement about borders far, far more difficult. And the fourth lesson, I think, is more a warning about not drawing the wrong lessons. It is very easy to talk and to think about what's happened with Northern Ireland as a model for what might happen with Scotland. The European Union, you know, for all the rhetoric, has been massively flexible about Northern Ireland. It's given Northern Ireland a position it would not give any other territory in the world. And that, I think, is due to the specifics of Northern Ireland. It's due to the history of violence on the island, it's due to the Good Friday Agreement, and crucially it is due to the fact that Northern Ireland engages the vital interests of an existing member state. It would be rash, I think, to assume that the European Union would be willing to show the same degree of flexibility to Scottish borders, because none of those three conditions apply. And finally, just to mirror what Nicola said, the state of the UK-EU relationship matters. I mean, there's a paradox here in the sense that it is possibly helpful for the independence cause that the UK and the EU are in a slight state of tension, because actually that can be portrayed with the more collaborative relationship that a future Scotland wishes to pursue. Post a vote for independence, I think it will be important for the negotiations around Scottish borders that relationships between London and Brussels are as cordial as possible. A state of tension between London and Brussels at the time when Scotland was deciding on how to implement new borders would make the situation infinitely more complicated than it would already be. And the final point is, this is all a moving target. If we have a government, as we seem to have at the moment in London, that is keen to diverge drastically from European Union rules, if the Freedom Bill, so-called, does what it's meant to do and leads to the removal of EU regulations from the statute book by the end of next year, that has massive implications for borders. It makes the GB-NI border a lot thicker than it currently is, simply because the UK will suddenly not be aligned with the European Union across a range of regulatory activity. So actually, the substantive nature of what government in Westminster is doing in regulatory terms will continue to shape the nature of an independent Scotland's borders, for better or for worse. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you to all our speakers. I suppose just to kickstart, I suppose pick up and drill into a few things that were brought up during the discussion. Basically starting with Angus. I know we're not going to get any speak previews, although I'm sure I will not be the first to attempt to get a sneak preview as we talk this through. I suppose in lots of what we discuss, there's almost a bit of a binary in that it's Scotland outside of the EU, as it is just now, and then there's Scotland within the EU as an independent state, and that's a very binary that we quite often conduct this debate in. I think we know that the reality of EU accession would not be that binary. It will not be a case of one day in the EU and the next day in the EU. So while the paper we'll see next week may go into this a bit more, I suppose it'd be good to get your thoughts on how you manage that bit in the middle, which actually is where some of the biggest tensions and disruptions, particularly around trade and economic matters, will come.
How long have we got?
So how long will the session take?
Well, I mean, the first thing, when I was listening to you say that, I was having these flashbacks to 2013, 2014, when people were telling us that we would automatically find ourselves outside the European Union, and it was actually taken seriously in the Fourth Estate as a prospect. I mean, seriously. And now we realise what a total nonsense it was. Just because one takes a vote on a subject doesn't mean that things happen immediately, and it doesn't mean that it's not subject to negotiation and discussion, arrangement and agreement. So in 2014, had we voted to become an independent country, we would still have been within the European Union. And the question then would have been, how could you change the status from within an EU context? And we know this, how do we know this? Because of how Brexit has worked. One voted 52-48 across the UK in favour of Brexit. We, of course, in Scotland voted 62-38 to remain in the European Union, and it took quite some time to negotiate from that position to the UK leaving the EU. So it stands to reason that one is talking about a process which will involve discussion, agreement, different interests, and these are factors which are being thought about, and you know, all of the variable factors of how well minded people are in terms of relations between the UK and the European Union are germane, but there are other relationships which matter too. And let's also not forget that the rest of the UK's relationship with Scotland matters. It matters in trading terms, it matters in political terms. We are 1/3 of Great Britain, and that has a whole series of contexts where we really matter for the rest of the United Kingdom. That does not mean that things will not be without complication, but at the same time, a lot of things that will have been described as being extremely difficult and impossible will suddenly be areas where one will have to get solutions to, and practicable working solutions to make things happen. So I'm beginning to get myself into the territory of what's in the paper, what's not in the paper, and so I'm going to have to stop on the detail at that point. Safe to say that this issue has been taken very seriously, as a lot of other issues are, especially relating to European Union membership. Why? Not just because of for all the good reasons that you pointed out, the tone of the debate, the importance of the relationship and domestic, but it also really matters that this is heard and understood across the European Union, its member states and European institutions. And it really matters to us that our interlocutors are, we hope, soon future partners in the European Union, know that we are serious and we are well prepared for the speediest re-accession into the European Union. Now, the point that was just made at the present time, the United Kingdom government is pursuing a legislative agenda which is, in effect, to take European legislation off the statute book, or take it significantly off the statute book. They're doing that without taking on board any of the points that we have been making, or indeed our Welsh Government colleagues have been making, about the impact that has on our domestic legislative situation. And this is way above and beyond the consideration of whether we think it's a good idea or not. Of course it's not a good idea. Having said that, the position of the Scottish Government is to remain aligned as closely as possible with the European Union and European Union legislation. That really matters. Why? Because when we get to a stage of seeking to get back in the European Union, incidentally, and an important consideration, the first part of the European Union to have left and to have sought to come back in within, we hope, a few number of years, is an important dimension to the relative ease with which we should be able to do that relative to other countries who have never been in the European Union. And for those of you in the room for whom this is not a specialist subject, there is not a queue to get in the European Union, and where one ends up in terms of consideration in European Union institutions, is not on when you declared your interest of getting in the European Union. Very important to be understood. But I just wanted to stress, and not least for the understanding of colleagues here from other countries, which is we are taking all of these perspectives extremely seriously, because not only is this going to inform the debate, it's going to inform the vote, it's going to inform people's voting intentions, but we're doing this not to have a referendum, we're doing this to have a referendum to become independent and to rejoin the European Union. So we are thinking a number of steps down the road about what it is that we need to what is it that we need to be thinking about? What is it that we need to be developing in terms of the policy areas? And to do that by talking with people here, but talking with people elsewhere as well, about what are those considerations. And beyond that, I'm going to get myself into trouble if I show too much leg.
We know we're getting closer. We know we're getting closer. So I suppose I would just continue that with one further question, and it'd be good to get Nicola and Anne to before we come to all of you. As you rightly say, the relationship with Bermuda, if we, let's move beyond session, move into a hypothetical where Scotland's an EU member, that relationship will remain incredibly important. I think, Nicola, something that's come out in your paper, the debordering effect that you have with 31 countries obviously gives you real significant economic advantages, but on current balance of trade, obviously the remainder UK, without a big shift, would remain independent Scotland's biggest trading partner. So to what extent, and again, I suppose it's more, we'll try and keep it to generalities, but it's more on Scottish Government's ambitions for trade. To what extent do you go with that, and you try to ensure that the remainder UK stays your largest trading partner, and to what extent do you try to shift that balance and tap into those 31 new markets?
So I don't think this is a mutually exclusive proposition. It really matters that we have the best possible trading relationship with the rest. Incidentally, of these islands, I say in the widest sense, the Irish market in particular is extremely important in Scotland, as is the rest of the United Kingdom. But at the same time, you're right in pointing out that becoming a member state of the European Union and being part of the single market means the eradication of borders between Scotland and a great number of countries. So I would like to see Scotland's trade flourish with the rest of these islands, but I'd like it to do that within the biggest single market in the world. And I think that's a huge prize for us. And it's a huge prize in terms of our food producers, in terms of our exporters, and I think it will be a huge fillip to the Scottish economy for us to be within the biggest single market in the world. And incidentally, I also think it's going to be, I go back to this point of thinking about how do other states perceive this. I actually think it's going to be really important for the government of the rest of the United Kingdom that Scotland succeeds in that wider European context, and that Scotland can be a conduit, can be a bridge in explaining the needs, interests, concerns and expectations of the rest of the United Kingdom as a member state of the European Union. I know we're getting ahead of ourselves in terms of thinking down the track, but I think thinking like a state, acting like a state is not a bad way to think about all of this. We are going to be really important for the rest of the United Kingdom, and not just in trading terms. And I think when we think in those terms, I think that will help us when we get beyond the yes vote, when we're getting beyond the negotiations, and when Scotland retakes its place in the European Union. I think it will matter to the rest of the UK that we succeed in that as well. They might not want to say it or think it at the moment, but I think it will be so.
I mean, the opportunity to bring Nicola again. I know you touched on some of this. It'd be good to get your sense of, to what extent living in the real world. Not to say, sorry, Angus, that anything you have said there, not living in the real world, but to what extent is that 31 versus 1 relationship and the balance of trade as it exists? Where are the risks, I suppose, but equally where are the opportunities that you find in the work that you've done?
So, I'm not an economist. I guess we'll talk more, I guess, about the importance of exports to the Scottish economy, and that I think has been harmed significantly in the context of Brexit, and that would presumably open up and benefit from EU membership. But I think your question is more about process and how you get there. And then I think we have actually learned quite a lot from the Brexit process in the context of withdrawal for what would be, first of all, an independence process within the United Kingdom. You can't become a member of the EU until you are independent. You can't be a candidate country until you are an independent country. But to me, it makes most sense that you, first of all, negotiate withdrawal, come to a withdrawal agreement, just as the UK did with the European Union, but you do that in terms of agreeing the exit, the divorce settlement, if you like, or whatever, however you want to think about it, of Scotland from the UK. Maybe you can debate whether that's an exit or a dissolution, but I think it's an exit. And then, during a transition period, you negotiate the future relationship between Scotland and the rest of the UK. Now, it makes sense to me that A, that is quite long, that transition period, considerably longer than 18 months, and longer than we had with Brexit. But B, that during that transition, you simultaneously have negotiations with the European Union. Because if you didn't do that, you would just have to do it all over again in the context of EU membership, because the Scottish-UK relationship in many, many ways will be the UK-EU relationship. It has to be in all of those areas over which the EU has competence. Now that creates enormous challenges for the Scottish Government of limited capacity to simultaneously negotiate a future relationship with the UK and try to negotiate accession within the context of the European Union too. But I think that makes sort of the most sense. There's one further thing I wanted to mention about the border. So in the case of the UK post-Brexit, not all of the border checks are in place for imports, and that has been a political choice that the UK government has made because of the economic impact that it anticipates having those checks would have. So in some ways, the challenges are potentially greater south to north than north to south. Now that is important for Scotland too, because of the reliance on trades flowing north and goods flowing north from the rest of the UK. And the other challenge that I didn't mention in the introduction but is detailed in the paper, and this is much more of a challenge for Scotland now, that while EU membership would open up the single market for an independent Scotland, there's a bit of a geographic problem in that the land route to that European market is via England. There are sea routes, but you would need to considerably invest in capacity to increase those. I'm sure that's already taking place anyway. But that is yet another logistical challenge, is what's called the land bridge between Scotland and the rest of what would be the rest of the European Union.
Thank you. I suppose, Anna, before we go to the audit, it'd be good because in particular, because a lot of this does come against the backdrop of Brexit. You obviously did lots of work during the Brexit process. As Nicola said, I suppose there's logistical and kind of policy challenges as much as the political challenges, and a lot of the Brexit process played out some political disharmony. What would you take from that experience, and what would your view be of how both governments should look to approach that process? What can we learn from the Brexit experience?
I mean, first and foremost, just on what Nicola said about borders, I mean, we're not implementing any of our borders as we should at the moment, arguably. So there are the grace periods with the Northern Ireland Protocol, so the protocol isn't being implemented as the letter suggests it should. And there are our decision to be slow about implementing checks on goods coming from the European Union. I mean, there's an interesting question there about how sustainable that is in the long term. Because, of course, UK exporters are screaming murder about this, which is that the EU has all its checks in place on our exports to them, whereas their exports to us are basically being waved through because we haven't put the infrastructure in place. I don't know how stable a situation that is going to be. On the politics, I mean, yeah, let me just take issue slightly with Angus on a couple of things. I mean, firstly, yeah, I mean, we can dream of a world in which an independent Scotland's success is wanted as much in London as it is in Edinburgh. That's not the world of politics I'm in at the moment in London. And of course, the other thing is, if you think back to Brexit, one of the reasons why people thought the European Union would play hardball with us was this notion of a fear of emulation. There will be a fear of emulation in London about this because, over the water you have Northern Ireland. And I think Northern Ireland is a ways off the border poll as yet, but a Scotland that leaves and is successful within the European Union would represent quite a powerful role model, I think, and I think that will get people in London nervous. So I think we can hope for a sort of friendly, positive sum view of the world from politicians. I don't think we can expect it. And just we don't want to agree with you too much on this panel. So just on the economics, the one thing I would say is there is a trade-off, isn't there, between opening your borders to trade with the European Union and your trade with the rest of the United Kingdom. There's an absolute trade-off. There was an LSE paper about this a couple of years ago, and what their forecast was that any gains that the Scottish economy would have from joining the European Union would be compensated for by exactly the same scale of loss in trade with the rest of the UK. Because as you're opening up to a market that is bigger but you don't trade with as much, you're putting checks and barriers in place with your major trading partners. So there is a trade-off there. It's not going to be a win-win.
I'm sure it's an issue we'll come back to much more, but for now, we really welcome any thoughts and comments from the audience. Two hands immediately went up at the back here, and then down at the front, so with that first.
Steve Norris, Kirkcudbright, branch convener. Great meeting, thanks very much. Fascinating content and interesting portents for the future. I have a couple of questions actually. One regards whether or not Keir Starmer's position of making Brexit work is sustainable in the light of a positive yes vote in a referendum. In other words, is there a chance that England itself might consider its position with regard to the EU in the happy event of a Scottish yes vote? In other words, the current isolationist policies have proved to be disastrous. Scotland becoming an independent member of the EU would strengthen its position. Is making Brexit work a sustainable strategy for the Labour Party? That's my first question. The second one is, I'm from the southwest near Cairnryan, which is a port at which border checks will be imposed to Northern Ireland on a whole range of goods. Do we have, if you like, an oven-ready, to coin a certain person's phrase, an oven-ready expertise to transfer from Cairnryan to the English border potentially to keep those checks on trade in goods from England? In other words, we will already have the skills and the people and the personnel on hand, but they wouldn't be applied to the border with Ireland, they'd be applied to the border with England. So the position may not be as bad as we think it might be in terms of the logistics of an independent Scotland. In fact, the converse is true, it will be entirely positive.
Donald Branney, Maryhill and Springburn. I don't see why England wouldn't want a successful trade deal with Scotland, given our position with oil, energy and other things.
Absolutely.
At the moment it's all been very negative. England wouldn't want this, England wouldn't that. I think it could possibly be otherwise.
I'm going to come to you because I think actually that latter question falls on the political reality of that relationship, but then I suppose also then links back into, could I get your perception of, what, I don't think I probably want to get into trying to guess Keir Starmer's political strategy, you may, but what does it mean for the future of the UK as Scotland wants to be independent? What does that relationship look like, and does the political reality actually lend itself to a harmonious relationship where one potentially has not existed to date, and the Brexit experience certainly didn't suggest might be 100% guaranteed?
Well, first off, to ask the question about expertise in Scotland relating to borders, immigration and so on, yes, there are, the Home Office currently has staff based in Scotland, based at Edinburgh Airport, based in Glasgow Airport, and there will also be arrangements in place in Cairnryan. Obviously we would wish them to be working to different rules and to a government that we actually elect, which would be a change, and not dealing with things such as seeking to arrest asylum seekers in Glasgow and elsewhere in ways that would not happen in the same way in an SNP governed independent Scotland. So yes, there's expertise, and so one is dealing with a transitional issue there. In terms of trade, I mean, one of the really interesting background statistics relates to the Irish economy and the extent to which Ireland was dependent on the United Kingdom as a dominant market for Irish products. And then since EEC, the European Union, membership, it's seen both a massive rise in exports more generally, but at the same time also having a very considerable trading relationship with Great Britain. So, you know, I don't want to take too much issue with you taking issue with, you know, let's also look at how it's worked in the real world with one of our closest neighbours. And I think, you know, I've got an aspiration that by making these better relationships, by making these better arrangements, that it will be a boost to business, boost to exports, boost to trade, and that we will be growing the cake, so to speak. And I think that's entirely possible. Why is it possible? Because it's happening elsewhere, and it's happened to other countries too. So, you know, I'm not wanting special arrangements. I think short of the point that was made about the common travel area, I think it's a very good understanding of what the arrangements are necessary within the European Union context, and we'll be taking all of that forward. But you know, let's go back to the basics of what we're talking about. Do we actually want to be in charge of making our own policy about these questions in Scotland, or do we want to leave this up to others that we haven't elected since 1955? We can talk about the details and take a different view about a little bit more or a little bit less of that in terms of specific policy issues. Do I think it would be a better thing for the Scottish Government to be in charge of borders, immigration, trade and so on than the UK Government? Unequivocally, yes. And I think you'll find most people in the room probably agree. And I would love to be able to put that case to the electorate. I mean, I would say, I would far prefer for the United Kingdom to be in the European Union, but that's beyond our control. So we have to live with the world as is, and for better or worse. And in this context, worse. And going back to, you know, Keir Starmer and make Brexit work. Well, I'm not going to spend any time on that because, you know, it's an oxymoron. You know, that it's an election strategy rather than a trading strategy or the relationship between the UK and the European Union. That's all about trying to win power in the English Midlands that voted leave. You know, make Brexit work. What a laugh. It's not. It's a disaster. And we should not emulate it, and we should not continue to be a part of that, and we should make our own way. Again, let's go back to basic principles. Look at every single one of Scotland's neighbouring nations. Every single one. All of them are wealthier. All of them are fairer. All of them are more successful. If it's good enough for them, it's good enough for us. Yes, we will need to find technical solutions, including areas where there are significant areas of technical arrangements that need to be made. I wrote something down right at the start. This is not an insurmountable challenge. No, it's not. And as far as I'm concerned, let's get on with it as quickly as we can.
I hate to bring it back to details before, so you've got two academics at the same time on the panel, Angus, so you picked the wrong ones.
Sorry, I chose to share the panel with you, so that's fine. It's fine.
Perfect. But Nicola, it might be good to bring you in because you again, we don't want to make this too technical, but I think you've alluded to the expertise points there. You alluded to the infrastructure points in your earlier answers. You know, I suppose from the work that again you've done, to what extent do you think, you know, is the infrastructure there, is the expertise there? If not, how could it be made to work? Or again, what are the what are the limiting factors, the risks?
I mean, I don't disagree with Angus on that the UK government has had to build expertise very quickly that it did not have. So I think there is a lot of learning to be done from what the UK government is doing on these issues, and how much of that resource that a Scottish government could access would be dependent on what you negotiate in your independence negotiations. Can I just go a bit beyond the technical flow? And actually, it's more small p political point, and I think that a lot of the challenges around this actually come before you have an independence referendum vote, and in the context of a campaign, because there is a psychology of the border, a border of the mind, if you like, a sense of, particularly in the border communities, for whom the thought of having any kind of checks at that border could be very, very difficult. It could be very difficult challenge for everyday experiences and lived experiences along the border, depending on the nature of those checks. And that's, I think, something that will, an awful lot of reassurance would have to be offered, meaningful reassurance, not, sort of promises, that could maybe ease anxieties around the effects of all of this. And on your question about why wouldn't a UK government want a good trade deal with Scotland, I think it probably would. If you got to the point of actually having independence negotiations, there would be interest on the side of the UK government to ensure stability, not least because it would have direct effects for them if there was instability north of the border. But if it was all about the economics, we would not have the Brexit trade deal that we have right now. So politics also matters to the eventual agreements that you have. Keir Starmer, yes, it's clearly an electoral strategy in as much as I'm comfortable talking about Brexit and the EU relationship, although you cannot be in government and not have a policy about the EU and your biggest trading partner. But there are many Brexits. So make Brexit work means just about as much as Brexit means Brexit meant initially. What kind of Brexit are you trying to make work? And it doesn't have to be the one that is currently in place. There are many, many options that could make the challenges that we're talking about here greater or less.
And Anna, before we go back to the audience, because you've just spent a couple of weeks at UK party conferences, it'd be good to get your perspective on where you think the politics at the UK level is, in particular Labour's position.
Yeah, I mean, Starmer's sort of made half a speech at the Centre for European Reform a few months ago about this, and it's quite clear that what Labour are proposing is minimal. Okay, I mean, it's veterinary agreements, it's SPS agreements. What that will achieve is it will make borders easier. It will make the Northern Ireland border much easier. It will have very, very limited economic consequences. But I think there's a dilemma, isn't there? And the dilemma is, the golden goose when it comes to economics is the single market. Being in the single market but not a member state is democratically problematic. So that's the bind Starmer finds himself in. Is it sustainable? Well, we don't know, because get back to me in 6 months' time. We're going to have a cost of living crisis, which is already showing signs of. If you think what I said before about Brexit tilting the axis of UK politics and making it about leave remain rather than left versus right, it might be that this winter tilts it back. And that's what Labour wants. Labour wants to be arguing about the economy, it doesn't want to be arguing about Brexit. But if, as part of the narrative of a failed Conservative government's economic strategy, if part of that narrative becomes, and the way they've done Brexit is problematic too, it might be that debate changes. I mean, it's very, very hard to say. What you see already across the UK very clearly is the poll shifting. There was a thing today where Rejoin was significantly ahead of Remain Out. There's an ever larger proportion of people that think the government has handled Brexit badly. And perhaps most crucially of all, John Curtis has found that a growing proportion of Leave voters now feel that Brexit has been bad for the economy. Now, in a world where economics dominates again, if that's the world we're entering, those findings suggest that the current situation might not be stable. And just finally on, why wouldn't they want us to do well? I mean, because politics, as Nicola said. I mean, pick up the Daily Telegraph and read the number of articles about why we want the EU to collapse. In rational economic terms, it makes no sense for the government in London to want the EU to collapse. It will have implications for us. But in political terms, it makes sense because it is a justification for Brexit. So I'm not saying it's rational or sensible or in the interests of your median voter. What I'm saying is if post-referendum politics disappears down the sort of rabbit hole that post-Brexit politics have, those sorts of things become more commonplace than perhaps we'd like them to.
Throw back out to the audience with any other comments or questions. We're at the front, and anyone else? I was amazed that none of you put your hands up yet, so so down at the front first.
John McCarthy, City of Dunfermline. Looking at the island of Ireland and even the rest of the UK, after independence, is there an opportunity for Scotland to become a gateway into the EU, not only for Ireland and the rest of the UK, but for the Western Atlantic region?
Yeah, I've spoken a few times to Alec Neil, who voted Brexit, who was obviously an SNP member, and his take on things is that an independent Scotland would be better joining EFTA, and he basically thinks that this issue of the border with England is so politically toxic, it would basically sink an independence campaign in a second referendum, and that's his view, and I just wondered what you made of that.
Thank you. I'm going to turn to you first. I'm not saying you'll tell us, but I'm also not imagining that the economic perspectives paper will say that your preferred option is EFTA. But what are those external opportunities out with the EU that you think exist? And again, I suppose, how do you take advantage of all opportunities to start to address that trade imbalance?
So, I think Scotland has a tremendous opportunity fully realising and reaching its potential as a Northern European nation. And its geostrategic location is also an important factor in this. And as we are learning with every day about our incredible opportunity in terms of renewables, specifically hydrogen, and if I can tell you why that's relevant above and beyond where we currently find ourselves as a European nation, 2% of Western Europe's population, 25% of the region's wind energy resource, is what's true for Scotland is in significantly measure also true with our Northern European neighbours, who are also extremely renewables rich, i.e. Iceland, Norway, and others. And I think we have a tremendous opportunity as the technology develops that we could see interconnection between Iceland, Norway, Scotland, and taking ourselves into the European continent, where there's a massive demand for hydrogen in particular in the German market and the Central European market. So I think a little bit of future-proofing of what we're trying to do is really important, and I think a Scotland that would be one of the largest hydrogen producers in Europe, if not the largest hydrogen producer for export, puts us in a very strong position, not just with other European Union states, not least with Germany, the most populous nation within the European Union, but also within the wider neighbourhood. And somebody might choose to observe that both Iceland and Norway are outside the European Union. If Scotland were within the European Union, this gateway point of being an important bridge to the European Union is made. I could go on at some further length as to why I also think that's relevant in a defence and security sense, not least what we've seen recently with what's gone on with subsea interference with the Nord Stream pipelines. We are surrounded by subsea architecture that really matters, and that has always been an important priority for us in terms of our thinking as Scotland as an independent Northern European nation. But your point is well made about Scotland as a gateway within our wider region for a better relationship with the European Union. absolutely in general, but I'm just giving you a very specific context for why that will matter. Hydrogen is coming, and it's just a fact that we are very fortunate to have won twice in the natural lottery. Hopefully we will win out of this one if we didn't win as much as we should out of the first. On the EFTA point, I'm not in favour of Scotland being a rule taker, as EFTA members are, where they have to incorporate European legislation without being part of the process of making that legislation. That's the beginning and the end of my thinking about that. There are very specific reasons why the EFTA member states are where they are, but I don't think that's the right course of action for Scotland to emulate. I think we need to be in and about the rules as they've been developed, the legislation as it's been developed. For those unaware of the advantages of being a member state of the European Union, that involves nominating a commissioner, that involves having a permanent seat in the Council of Ministers, it involves being in the European Parliament, and in all of these three institutions, we would have direct representation, and then of course there would be Scottish representation in the European Court of Justice. So we would be fully part of the rule making, but also the interpretation of those rules. That's why being a member state is a thoroughly good thing, all incidentally things that we don't get within the United Kingdom.
There's another issue around EFTA too, in that, I mean, the thinking presumably is that you overcome the problems that having a customs border would present, but get the benefits of being within the single market. The challenge is that you maintain your customs border with the European Union, and you have a regulatory border with the rest of the United Kingdom, and actually disentangling these is quite difficult, particularly if you had a UK government that was intent on moving potentially quite far from the regulatory system that the European Union maintains. So you have two borders.
It's also politically, I mean, one of the things that Brexit teaches, I mean, think of the number of Brexit supporters who saw the EEA as a natural landing zone post-referendum. Then you run a referendum campaign that is based on the idea of sovereignty and control. It's virtually, I mean, it is so difficult to pivot from that argument that we need to be in charge of our own affairs to actually, let's let someone else regulate our economy. It's just very, very hard to do, I think, practically after a popular vote.
I've got time for any last comments or questions. We have to wrap up, so down front here, and any last ones? Is that it? Final call?
Angus, do you accept that the question of borders is your hardest sell at the next referendum?
Well, the first point that I would make, seeing everything in terms of downsides, is not where I'm at. So I started, and so I'll finish this. Thank you, Conor, for giving me the opportunity to finish where I started. Let's start with basic principles. Normal countries are in charge of their borders, and whether you choose to do that by sharing your sovereignty with a multilateral organisation like the European Union, or you do it yourself, that is better than letting other people manage and run that on your behalf. Incidentally, people who we have not elected since 1955. So let's just start with basic principles. I think it would be much better for Scotland to be within the European Union, making decisions, as I've explained, through the institutions of the European Union. I think Scotland becoming an independent sovereign state that is within the European Union is the best place for Scotland to be, and I think it will give us significant advantages, and I look forward to reading about those in the Scotsman.
I don't think there's any point in trying to go it's a good natural point to leave it. So I think also to say is a huge thank you to the speakers. It's been a really fascinating discussion. I think not least with the economic paper being released next week, the discussion is only just starting. I know that Anna, Nicola and I will all look forward to playing a part in that and carrying on beyond this. But huge thanks in particular to Angus, huge thanks to Anna and in particular UK and Changing Europe helping support this event. And finally, to Nicola for speaking, and thank you to all of you.
Thank you. Sorry, we're trying to make life a bit easier for you. Sorry. See you bobbing up every time. Thank you for sorry about that.
Oil's the key. Oil and energy.
You're fine, you've got an hour about.
Hello, nice to see you. You well? Good to see you. Yeah. I look forward to it.
How are you? Are you well?
I am. Yeah.
Are you always kind of wind up staging next year?
Yes. Trying to do
Yeah.
what else?
Oh, you still got 1 month? Okay, good. I thought it was the start of the year. Oh, okay. All right.
Well,
That's what he's getting in London. Yeah, the educational ambassador. Yeah, so he's loving